I've never had a Game Boy Advance SP, but it is something that I've always wanted. I absolutely love the clamshell design of the 3DS, and the Game Boy was the console that I probably played the most when I was younger. Loads of kids on our street had Game Boys and we'd often play together, so I've got a lot of fond memories for this console. Being younger though, that meant that I barely had any money of my own, so I couldn't just upgrade to an SP no matter how cool I thought they were. Now this may look like a Game Boy Advance SP, but it's actually the Anbernic RG35XX SP. Spec-wise, it is identical to the RG35XX Plus, which was a slightly more powerful version of the original RG35XX that came out in the last year or so, which I did a long-term review video for. I know the names are a bit much, but just bear with me. The key differences with this model, of course, is that form factor, and I was so excited to hear that this was coming. I was this close to buying a modded Game Boy Advance SP with an upgraded screen and battery, so having the option to buy something like this, which was a bit cheaper as well, was great. It plays all of the early gaming systems up to and including PS1, PSP and DS, but performance varies a little per game on those higher powered systems like the PSP and the DS. This isn't really a first impressions. At this point I've had mine for about 5 or 6 weeks maybe, but at the same time it's not really a long-term review either, and that's mainly because I don't think it's been out long enough that anybody can really be doing a long-term review at this point. So I'm kind of treating this as something in between. I've had a chance to mess around with a bunch of different games and emulators. I've tinkered with it, changed settings, tried a custom firmware, and this is what I think of the SP so far. Now there's 4 different color choices and I got this blue one. I've really started to like clear shells, for at least for these smaller handhelds anyway, and I think this one looks the best. And when I first got it out of the box, the first thing that I noticed when I held the RG35XX SP, I'm just going to start calling it the SP from now on by the way. The first thing that I noticed when I held the SP was that it's a bit larger in the hand than I expected. The section that you hold with the buttons on, it's maybe about twice the thickness of the screen, where I was expecting it to be maybe a little bit thicker, but not quite this much. Over time though, this is something that I've gotten used to, and the system does feel pretty good to hold. I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube where they do the pocket test, but a lot of them are wearing sort of these like joggers or cargo pants with really large pockets. Now I mostly wear jeans, or now that it's warmer, I wear shorts, and the device does still fit pretty nicely into those pockets too, although you wouldn't want to keep much else in the same pocket. When you first turn the SP on, you're greeted by the stock OS that's been created by Anbernic. Now, when I got my very first RG35XX, I didn't even try this stock operating system and I switched straight over to Garlic OS. But since this device is so new, there isn't really one universally agreed on custom firmware that is just the best at everything. So to start with, I gave stock a go. It does have some quirks and there are a few things that need adjusting that I've discovered, but on the whole it works pretty well out of the box. I think they've made some really good progress with this. One quick thing to note is that usually with these handhelds, the first piece of advice is straight away you should swap out the SD card to a branded one. But Anbernic now seem to be supplying better SD cards at the moment, so the one that came with mine is branded Kioxia, I think that's how you pronounce that, and a quick Google search shows that this actually is part of Toshiba, so I'm sticking with it for now to see how long it lasts. But don't worry, I am backing up my saves every so often. When it comes to actually getting into a game, your initial instinct would be to go into game rooms to find something to play, and I wouldn't blame you, but actually you want to completely ignore this, and this is one of those quirks with the operating system. For some reason, it's got worse performance when you start running games this way, and so instead you want to go to RA, which stands for RetroArch. This gives you the performance that you'd expect from all games. So once you're in here, you go through the different consoles, pick the one you want, and choose the game that you want. And you can also press the start button to favorite some games. I like to favorite a handful that I'm trying to get through, but not too many at one time. This device came originally with just so many consoles and games, stuff that I'd never even heard of before. I don't really know how they can get away with just selling a device like this with all of these games on there, but putting that aside, it's just too many games anyway for anyone to play, and there's bound to be hundreds and hundreds on here that you're never going to want to get through. So I have started to whittle these systems and games down to things that I'm more interested in, but it's a work in progress still. Once you're in a game, then on the stock OS, the menu button opens up the RetroArch settings. From here you can do all sorts of things like save and load states, change shaders, change borders. There's loads of stuff to get into here, plenty that I don't think you should change unless you really know what it is that you're doing, so I don't touch half these settings. One thing that I do change in here though is the auto save state and auto load state. Now by default, when you close a game and then start up again, it'll launch that game from scratch. However, coming from Garlic OS on the original RG35XX, I really liked how it saved and loaded a save state straight away so that you didn't need to sit through the menu again. You could just go right back into the game where it was that you left off. And you can do this on this handheld as well, but it's a little fiddly. So come out of the quick menu, go to settings, then saving, and then go down to auto save state and auto load state. Once you've changed that, then normally what you would do is you go into the main menu configuration file to save what you've changed, and this would save it globally for all emulators. But I found that this doesn't actually stick, it doesn't save properly, and the next time the settings just revert back. So instead you have to go back into the quick menu, down to overrides, then click save content directory overrides. I don't understand why trying to save it globally doesn't really stick. It can be a bit annoying because then that means you have to do it again for each and every emulator. So you have to do it once for Game Boy Advance, once for Game Boy Color, PlayStation 1, and so on. But once you've done it once for each one, then you are all set. And so when you close out of a game and go back into it later, you pick up exactly where you left off. Just keep in mind, it only works for emulators within RetroArch, so PSP and I think the DS, the emulator settings are totally different, but for most consoles it does work. I really like this for being able to switch between games faster. I tend to jump around a little bit between games, so this setting is great for me. There is one area where I think the SP might be a little bit divisive, especially compared to other handhelds of a similar nature, and that area is the buttons. So the buttons are just so clicky and pretty loud, especially to start with. It was at the point where I'd be using it in the living room the first few days that I had it. My wife's watching TV and I'll be cringing a little inside because I'm sort of clicking away over and over, and there's no way that she can't hear it, and there's no way that it's not distracting a little bit from whatever she's watching. I know there are folks out there who love a clicky button. Normally I don't mind too much either way, whether buttons are clicky or soft, but I would like these ones to be a little bit softer. Now I have seen a comment or two online from people who got the SP day one and then used it loads. I've seen them say that, over time the buttons aren't quite as clicky, and I've maybe found that myself. It's hard to tell after, these sort of 5 or 6 weeks, but it doesn't seem to be annoying me quite as much. But just be aware, especially at first, these buttons are really quite clicky and loud. So, since this is a clamshell, you might be wondering what happens when you close the lid. And yes, Anbernic have thought of this too. Go into App Center and then to Apps, pick the first memory card slot and then go down to Quick Shutdown. First of all, enable this. It means that if you're in game and you tap the power button, it'll create a save state, shut down completely, and then when you turn it on again, it'll boot right back into your game and load the state instead of starting at the main menu. Once you pick that setting, then it'll ask you what you want to do when you close the lid. And the options are between shutdown and sleep. Shutdown is that exact same quick shutdown that we just talked about. Sleep mode doesn't shut the system down and it stays on. Now the benefits of this is that when you open it up again, it comes on instantly without any boot up time or having to use the power button. But the downside is that it will continue to drain battery while it's in sleep, and at a fairly decent rate. I've seen people say sort of 4 to 5% per hour. So it's up to you which way you prefer this. The power drain really put me off sleep at first, and so I was using it as a shutdown, but after a few days I did switch back to sleep mode. In terms of game performance, this one runs really nicely at the level you'd expect from a device of this price. The much older systems run basically flawlessly, and the SP can attempt to run games all the way up to Nintendo DS and PSP, although I have had mixed results with these last two. So for example, on PSP I struggled to get games like God of War running smoothly. Even using frame skipping, you can see that it is quite slow here. And DS seems to work better, so here is Lego Star Wars running okay. And I've even tried some DS Pokemon games on there too. They mostly run fine, but of course it's not necessarily ideal playing the dual screen games on there, and even less so games that have heavy use of touchscreen, because the device doesn't have a touchscreen but it just has a sort of activatable pen that you can then control with the buttons. Everything else though runs really nicely. On my original Anbernic RG35XX and the Miyu Mini, there were some heavier Game Boy Advance games that had a little bit of noticeable slowdown, so things like Final Fantasy VI. But here on the SP, with that slightly faster chipset, it seems to have helped things along, and I've not really come across any game that it struggles with from those older systems. And the battery life is really good. I tend to play in these shorter sessions, you know, something like 15-20 minutes at a time, and I'm finding that I'm not really having to charge very much at all, maybe once a week or so. I have found that I'm mostly playing GBA games though. I mean, I suppose that makes sense. It basically is an SP, so I would guess that if you're constantly running PS1 games, for example, on here, then it'll probably drain a little bit faster for you. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in this video is custom firmware. I mentioned it already, but everything that we've talked about so far has been using the stock operating system that comes from Anbernic with the SP when you get the device. When I ordered mine, I did have a look around at all the different options for custom firmware, but in the end I decided that there wasn't one that stood out to me enough to make it worth switching over straight away. So there are a few different options: Buttercera, MinUI, MuOS, but none of them were just universally better. There always seemed to be some kind of downside. Most of them couldn't even utilize closing the lid, for example, which felt to me like it took away one of the key reasons that I bought the SP. However, just as I'm writing and recording this, MuOS has put out a new update called Refried Beans. I don't know why they name it that, that's just what it's called. The Refried Beans version of MuOS now officially supports the RG35XX SP, which now includes proper support for the lid. And I've currently got a second SD card set up with MuOS, and that's because of a couple of things. First is that lid support. Like I mentioned, this operating system has a few different options for how you want the device to behave when you close the lid, and one of them I actually think is the best way to work with it and to take most advantage of that clamshell design. So I've got it set up now that when you close it, the system goes to sleep, so if you turn it back on again, it will open up instantly, but after a set period of time that you can choose, so for example 5 minutes, then it will fully shut down. This is amazing to me. Now, if I'm playing a game, I can always flip that lid shut no matter what. And if I get to come back to it quite quickly, then great, I'm instantly back in because of the sleep mode. And if I can't get back to it quite quickly, I don't need to be worried about the battery draining away in sleep mode, because it'll just shut down after 5 minutes. The second main reason that I am trying this operating system is the boot up time. So Anbernic's stock OS, it wasn't awful, as in, you know, it didn't take so long to boot up that you were wondering if it was broken, but it wasn't exactly what I would call quick either. Maybe it took about 20 seconds, and MuOS is much quicker. It must cut that time in half really, and I know that that's not such a huge deal, you know, 10 versus 20 seconds, but just those two things combined, the lid and the faster boot up time, combined, it made me feel like it was worth trying out, and so far I am liking it. The setup process isn't too bad, but it is maybe a little bit more technical than normal. You have to flash the SD card, which is common, but for some reason everyone advises that you have to use a particular program to do it, rather than just any flashing program. I also managed to move over all of my saves, which is great, except for one, and no matter what I tried, you know, switching cores, moving this save file around, my Chrono Trigger save just would not seem to work. I don't really know why. Overall though, I am liking it a little more so far than the stock OS, mostly for the two main reasons that I mentioned, and it is also nice that you don't have to worry about that whole broken game room option in the stock OS. So far, while I do think MuOS is better, you do still have to go through a fairly lengthy setup process, and so if you're somebody who's not really that interested in trying these things out and you just want to play, then it's probably not really worth it to switch over, and you should just stick with the stock OS. On the other hand, if you are somebody who really likes to tinker with these devices and get, you know, the most out of it, even if it's just a few small advantages, then, you know, go for it, have fun switching over to a different operating system, and MuOS is the one that I like the most at the moment. So I've had 3 of these handheld emulators so far, and I've got to say that this one is by far my favorite. I absolutely love the clamshell design, and with the support on both of these operating systems that I've mentioned, closing the lid now works exactly how I would like it to. It runs all of the consoles you'd expect pretty well, up to the higher end ones that are maybe pushing it a bit but still usable. It's got great battery life and loads of optional features that you can really dive into if you're that way inclined. The only downside for me is how noisy those buttons are, and we'll see if it does get any better over time. And I will say that even though all of the handheld emulators I've had so far came with screen protectors, so that they're all protected with these sort of pretty nice looking screen protectors that seem like they'll do a good job, I am still way less concerned to take this one around with me because of that lid, and the SP has everything that I need, so it's definitely going to be the one that I use over the original RG35 RG35XX and also over the Miu Mini Plus. In terms of software, I like the original RG35XX the most with Garlic OS. I know a lot of people really like Onion OS on the Miu Mini Plus, but there are a lot of things on there that I just couldn't really get to work as they intended. So yeah, in terms of software, the RG35XX is my favorite. But then in terms of hardware, I like the SP the most. The custom firmware for the SP might not be quite on the level of those two other devices just yet for a lot of people, but there does seem to be a lot of excitement around the SP, so I think that in just a few months the landscape for custom firmware will probably look totally different. So there we have it. You can probably tell by now that I love this thing, but I would love to hear what you guys think as well. Does the clamshell design do it for you, or are you maybe holding off to see what happens with custom firmware down the line? I really hope you found this video useful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.